Hey, Push students, grab your Period 2 study guide from the Ultimate Review Packet and let's review. There are 5 big picture ideas that you want to remember from Period 2. First, European powers transitioned from exploration to colonization under the mercantilist system. This helped them build wealth and power while increasing religious competition between Protestants and Catholics. Second, unlike other European powers, the British colonies in America saw mass migration due to opportunities for religious freedom, economic opportunity, and social mobility. Third, the British American colonies developed into distinct regions, mostly due to their geography. Northern colonies had economic and cultural diversity, while the southern colonies relied on plantation agriculture and enslaved labor. Fourth, as more British colonists migrated further into the American frontier, Native Americans continued to resist colonization with violent uprisings such as King Philip's War. And finally, the American colonies developed a unique identity separate from Great Britain because of religious events like the First Great Awakening and the relaxed economic policies under salutary neglect. Here are some key terms that you want to make sure that you remember from Period 2. Grab a highlighter so that you can mark them as we review together. And while Period 2 is full of important figures, there are 5 main characters you want to make absolutely sure you know. All right, here we go. Period 2 starts with the competition between the European powers to explore and colonize the America, which began with the Spanish. In New Spain, conquistadors enslaved Native Americans and forced them to convert to Catholicism under the encomienda system. But English colonization was different from the Spanish in a few ways. First, Spanish men mostly came to the Americas, but the British settlers came as families. Next, the Spanish were mostly in Central and South America and in the American Southwest, but the British settled in North America along the Atlantic coast. Also, the Spanish were Catholic, while the British came as a variety of religions like Protestants, Puritans, and Quakers. And while the Spanish colonies were heavily controlled by their crown, the British colonies enjoyed a great deal of freedom from the mother country. On the other hand, French and Dutch colonization in the Americas was pretty similar. Both made money in fishing or fur trading, especially beaver pelts. Both also had friendly relationships with Native Americans that were trade-based and saw slow population growth. But this was much different from the British, who often forced Native Americans off of their land, causing a ton of violent conflicts. They also didn't really attempt to maintain peaceful trade relations. These conflicts were made worse by the fact that the British population grew extremely fast, since the British came as families to settle permanently. Let's talk more about English colonization in North America. After colonists failed to settle Roanoke Island, England's first permanent settlement was at Jamestown. Jamestown was established as a joint stock endeavor by the Virginia Company. This meant that a group of wealthy investors funded the colony. This was supported by the British government, who hoped the settlers would find gold. The colonists at Jamestown faced many hardships from the beginning. They saw brutal winters and often had conflicts with native groups like the Powhatan. And since Jamestown is essentially a swamp, they lacked adequate drinking water. And since there was no gold found in the region, they struggled to make any money. Despite the challenges, both John Rolfe and John Smith helped to make Jamestown successful. John Smith declared that those who don't work won't eat, so he helped the colony thrive. He was also helpful in helping recruit new colonists. And with the help of Pocahontas, John Rolfe learned how to successfully grow tobacco in Virginia, making it hugely profitable. In fact, tobacco made so much money for the colony, it was called brown gold. The successful Jamestown colony eventually expanded into the Virginia colony. This, coupled with Maryland, made up what we know as the Chesapeake region. And like we said before, tobacco cultivation turned the small settlement of Jamestown into the lucrative Virginia colony. It created massive profit for the Virginia Company. Because of this, Virginia established plantation agriculture, which required a large labor force. And to fulfill this need for labor, the colony established what's called the headright system. Under this system, Virginians were granted 50 acres of land to anybody who could pay to transport colonists to Virginia. This caused wealthy planters to amass huge tracts of land. This also caused a large number of indentured servants to live in Virginia, leading to a great deal of social stratification in the area. As Virginia grew, the colonists established what's known as the House of Burgesses, which is the first elected legislative body in the colonies. This sets up a tradition of self-government and is one of the long-term causes of the American Revolution. Despite being founded as a joint stock colony, Virginia transitioned to a royal colony in 1624. This was because while tobacco was profitable, it still wasn't enough, and the colonists still didn't find any gold. Also, Virginia continued to have violent conflicts with Native Americans, which were expensive. So King Charles declared Virginia a royal colony under direct control of the crown. One of the most important events that took place in the Virginia colony that you need to know for your exam is Bacon's Rebellion. There were 2 major issues that caused the rebellion. First, Nathaniel Bacon, along with many small frontier farmers, mostly former indentured servants, were struggling with natives on the frontier, and they felt the government was not doing enough to help them protect their lands and families. The other cause was the class struggle between the wealthy elites who controlled the government and the lower class, who had basically no political power in the House of Burgesses. Nathaniel Bacon gathered colonists from all backgrounds. They drove out Governor Berkeley and torched Jamestown. But Bacon eventually died of dysentery and the rebellion ended. Ultimately, the conflict highlighted the threat of the lower classes, especially those former indentured servants, to the power of the wealthy elites. This caused the colony to switch from using indentured servants to instead importing African enslaved laborers. Also after the rebellion, the elites attempted to further separate white and black laborers so that they wouldn't organize against the planter class again. They did this by implementing restrictive slave codes. The other Chesapeake colony was Maryland, which was founded by Lord Baltimore as a refuge for Catholics. Just like Virginia, Maryland had a cash crop economy that centered around tobacco plantations. In 1649, the colony passed the Act of Toleration, which ensured religious freedom to all settlers in the colony, but only if they were Christian. Now let's talk about the New England colonies. The Plymouth colony was founded in 1620 by a group of separatists who wanted to establish their own church separate from royal control. These colonists arrived in America on the Mayflower. One important passenger was William Bradford, who would go on and govern the colony for over 30 years. One of the most important documents from period 2 is the Mayflower Compact. The settlers that arrived at Plymouth wrote the Mayflower Compact to establish law and order in Plymouth and to allow for self-government. This compact wasn't just between the colonists on the ship, it was also between the colonists and God, showing how important religion was to these settlers. Plymouth was later absorbed into the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was founded by John Winthrop. In one of his sermons, John Winthrop described the colony as a city upon a hill. He wanted Massachusetts to be an example of a perfect Puritan community that others would look up to. But the colonies of Rhode Island and Connecticut were very different from Massachusetts. Rhode Island was established by Roger Williams, who was banished from Massachusetts in 1635 for questioning church leaders. He believed that religion and the law should be separate, and the Puritan leaders did not like that. He also thought that natives should be compensated for their land. So when he was exiled, he formed the colony of Rhode Island, which was known for religious tolerance and a great degree of political freedom. And later in 1638, Anne Hutchinson was also banished from Massachusetts because she was preaching, which women were not exactly allowed to do at the time. More importantly, she supported a direct relationship with God and the concept of antinomianism. This was a direct challenge to the colony's religious leaders. And leaders in Connecticut established the fundamental orders, which acted as a constitution for the colony. These defined the powers and limitations of government, forming a confederation under the guidance of God. This is just another example of the tradition of self-government that was being established in the colonies. Something unique about the New England colonies is that they almost always settled in towns. This is because the Puritans were extremely religiously strict and they wanted to be able to monitor each other's behaviors. And since they were close together and could meet regularly, this also allowed for decisions to be made directly by all male citizens that were, of course, in good standing with the church. And remember, the motive to move to Virginia was profit, so most settlers were young single men, but the settlers of New England mostly came as families because they wanted to be able to practice their faith freely. And due to harsh winters and poor soil, New England was not ideal for large-scale farming. Instead, the economy was centered around local lumber, which was used in sawmills and shipbuilding. This also helped them develop large port cities like Boston. Let's move on to the middle colonies. The middle colonies include Pennsylvania, Delaware, New York, and New Jersey. Pennsylvania was founded as a proprietary colony by William Penn. This colony was known as Penn's Holy Experiment because they supported religious freedom, fair treatment of natives, and no military. And Penn was also given complete political control of his colony without any interference from Parliament. The other middle colonies of New York and New Jersey formed in a unique way. In 1664, the British took over Dutch New Amsterdam to eliminate European competition in North America and to connect their colonies on the Atlantic coast. The colony was renamed New York and then later split to form the colony of New Jersey. The middle colonies were the most economically diverse. The land was really good for growing wheat and corn, and so they were also known as the breadbasket colonies. And they developed industries like ironworking and shipbuilding. Trade was also really important to the middle colonies because two of the largest port cities were established at New York and Philadelphia. The middle colonies were also more ethnically diverse than any of the other colonies. When the Dutch controlled New Amsterdam, they pretty much allowed settlers from anywhere. And when New Amsterdam then became New York, the British allowed them to stay. William Penn also allowed settlers from anywhere as long as they didn't disrupt his peaceful community. This led the region to be religiously diverse as well, as Quakers, Catholics, and Jews settled in the colony. The last of the 13 colonies was the South, which was made up of the Carolinas and Georgia. Although it was initially chartered as just one colony, the Carolinas split into two in 1729. The southern part of Carolina became a lot wealthier, and it was just too difficult to rule such different colonies at the same time. So North Carolina became known for its small tobacco farms, while South Carolina became wealthy growing rice, indigo, and other cash crops. And like Virginia, South Carolina developed a plantation-based economy using enslaved laborers. South Carolina also had a huge port city at Charleston. And finally, Georgia was established in 1732 to act as a buffer colony to protect wealthy South Carolina from Spanish Florida. and to relieve overcrowding in British jails. Now let's talk about economic motivations for settling the colonies. The British colonies were founded under the theory of mercantilism. According to this theory, a country would become wealthy by increasing the amount of gold and silver it had. The goal of mercantilism was to maintain a favorable balance of trade, which just means exporting more goods than a country has to import. To protect their colonial investments, the British passed what they called the Navigation Acts. Under these laws, goods going to British colonies had to be carried on English ships run by English sailors, and they had to go through England first. And many enumerated goods like sugar and tobacco had to come from English merchants or traders. But the Navigation Acts were loosely enforced in a period known as salutary neglect. This meant that even though there were laws on the books, England generally turned a blind eye to the colonies as long as they made profit for the crown. Colonists enjoyed a great deal of economic freedom during this time period, and this allowed some of them to amass huge personal profits because they smuggled goods. During the colonial period, there were several conflicts between settlers and Native Americans, which were usually caused by disagreements over land use. There are a couple major conflicts that you want to know for your AP exam. First is the Powhatan Uprising of 1622, where the Powhatan tribe led a surprise attack against the settlers of Jamestown. Next, the Pequot Wars, which took place from 1636 to 1638. This occurred in Connecticut as Native Americans fought against the increase of Puritans in the region as a result of the Great Migration. And King Philip's War, also known as Metacom's War. Metacom led a rebellion in 1675 after becoming frustrated with numerous treaty violations by the settlers in Massachusetts. This is generally known as the end of Native American resistance in New England after 3,000 natives died in the conflict. And finally, the Pueblo Revolt, which took place in 1680 under the leadership of Pope. This conflict differed from the others because it was against the Spanish, and it was successful in driving the Spanish out for over a decade. In 1619, a Dutch ship carrying 20 African servants arrived on the coast of Virginia. This marked the beginning of the importation of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Most of these laborers arrived on a horrific journey known as the Middle Passage. This was the portion of the triangular trade where the enslaved were transported to the Americas in brutal conditions across the Atlantic. Between 10 to 20% of those who were forced on the Middle Passage lost their lives. Eventually, the Virginia colony established a system called chattel slavery, where enslaved laborers were property, not people. Under this system, slavery was a condition that was inherited at birth. And slave codes were laws that were passed in order to restrict the behavior of enslaved laborers. These laws were stricter in the southern colonies than they were in other regions, because in the South, large plantations employed a large number of enslaved workers, and the laws were meant to prevent rebellion. Slave codes also created a strict racial structure, which defined the relationships between black and white residents throughout the South. Of course, the harsh conditions of slavery often led to resistance, and slave laborers would fake illness or break tools in order to resist. Sometimes there were even large rebellions, such as the Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina, which was the largest. Those who revolted were hoping to make it to Spanish Florida, where they were promised their freedom. Ultimately, 30 white colonists and 44 enslaved Africans were killed. The most significant effect was that South Carolina and other colonies with high enslaved populations passed stricter slave codes. Let's finish up by talking about some unique events in colonial culture and society. One phenomenon that took place in Massachusetts in 1692 was the Salem witchcraft trials, and historians continue to debate the causes, but some include boredom among young girls in Salem, a general belief that witches caused bad events like crop shortages and deaths, a political and social divide that caused the wealthy elites to blame poor women in society, and even ergot poisoning because of a bad season of crops. In the 1730s, the First Great Awakening became one of the first shared events across the colonies. This religious movement was caused by geographical separation from Great Britain and the fact that several generations had passed since the original religiously devout settlers came to the Americas. Because of this, new Christian denominations were formed, like the Baptist and the Methodist. An individual started questioning church authority, which led some to also question British authority. Two of the most famous preachers of the Great Awakening were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Despite both being revivalist preachers and both stressing the importance of the individual and their relationship with God, they had a few differences. First, Edwards was a Congregationalist, while Whitefield was an Anglican. Next, Edwards' message focused on the wrath of God and invoked fear and demanded repentance. This is seen in his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. On the other hand, Whitefield's message was more uplifting and focused on salvation and a personal connection with God. Edwards mostly preached in New England, while Whitefield traveled throughout the colonies, focusing in the rural agricultural areas of the South. Another notable event that you might see is the Zanger trial. In 1733, New York printer John Peter Zanger was put on trial for writing seditious libel against the royal governor, which was illegal at the time. Ultimately, the jury sided with John Peter Zanger, stating that the newspaper could openly criticize the royal governor. This was an important trial because it set an early precedent for freedom of the press, which will eventually be established with the First Amendment. So there's a quick walkthrough of Period 2. Now that we reviewed, see if you can answer the practice questions at the bottom of your review sheet. And if you need more help with Period 2, make sure to check out our timelines and practice sheets. Thanks for watching.